Richard Miller was not an ordinary man. He was a father, a mother, a protector, and a provider all rolled into one. When his wife passed away unexpectedly, leaving him alone with 7 young children, the world thought his life would collapse. But Richard looked into the eyes of his children, Michael, David, John, Emily, Sarah, Anna, and the youngest, James, and made a silent promise. I will raise you. I will give you everything I have, even if it costs me my life. The Miller household was never quiet. Michael, the eldest, was the responsible one, often trying to act like a second father. David, the second-born, was mischievous and playful, always pulling pranks that made the younger ones laugh. John was quiet but brilliant, burying his nose in books and asking endless questions about the world. Emily and Sarah, the 2 sisters, filled the house with their singing and playful arguments about clothes, dolls, and school. Anna, the sensitive one, often clung to Richard's arm, whispering her dreams about becoming a teacher. And then there was James, the baby of the family, who ran around the house with unmatched energy, his giggles echoing through every room. The mornings began early in the Miller home. Richard would rise before dawn, pack lunches for 7 kids, iron their school uniforms, and prepare breakfast. He would wake them with a gentle knock on their doors, calling out, "Rise and shine, Miller crew." The kids would groan, laugh, and eventually stumble into the kitchen, filling the table with chatter. Pancakes, eggs, toast, and orange juice were served with laughter, and Richard would smile, sipping his coffee, pretending not to notice when David hid toast in his pocket to avoid eating vegetables. After school, the Miller house turned into a carnival. Michael would help with homework, Emily and Sarah would argue over the TV remote, and James would chase John around the living room. The walls echoed with laughter, the floor shook with running feet, and Richard would often sit in his chair, tired but deeply fulfilled. He was exhausted from working 2 jobs, but the sight of his children made every ache worth it. Neighbors often asked him, "Richard, how do you do it? How do you manage 7 children all by yourself?" He would smile and reply, "It's not a burden. It's my blessing." But behind the smile was sacrifice. Richard skipped meals so the children could have seconds. He worked overtime shifts so they could have new shoes. He never bought himself new clothes, wearing the same coat winter after winter, because Emily needed a new dress for her recital, or James wanted a soccer ball. He lived for them, breathed for them, and loved them with every part of his soul. Holidays were magical in the Miller home. Richard decorated the house himself, sometimes with mismatched lights and uneven Christmas trees. But to the children, it was perfect. Birthdays were small but filled with joy. A cake, a few candles, and a father's love was all they needed. Richard made sure his kids never felt less than anyone else, even if it meant staying up all night fixing broken toys or sewing torn clothes. Every night, after the children had fallen asleep, Richard would quietly walk into each of their rooms, kiss them on the forehead, and whisper, "Daddy's proud of you." He would then sit at the kitchen table, bills spread across the surface, calculating how to stretch every dollar. His eyes were tired, his back ached, but his heart was full. He believed that one day his children would understand the depth of his sacrifices. In those years, the Miller home was alive. There was chaos, noise, and sometimes even fights, but it was a home built on love. Richard believed that as long as laughter filled those walls, nothing else mattered. He thought his children would always remember those days, that the bond they shared would remain unbreakable. But time has a cruel way of changing things. The very laughter that gave Richard life would one day fade into silence. The very children he raised with his sweat and tears would one day drift away. He didn't know it then, but the joy he created would soon be replaced by loneliness so heavy it would crush him. Before we move forward into the heartbreaking turns of this story, I want to pause and speak directly to you, the listener of this journey. Stories like Richard Miller's are not just tales. They are lessons, reflections of reality, and reminders of the value of love and family. If you are moved by this story, if you feel the depth of his sacrifice, and if you want to walk with me through the rest of this emotional journey, then, backhand index pointing right, please subscribe to this channel. Backhand index pointing right, hit the notification bell so you never miss these powerful real-life stories. Backhand index pointing right, like, and share this video to spread awareness about family values. Backhand index pointing right, and most importantly, comment below if you've ever seen or lived a story like this. Because Richard's journey is not just his. It belongs to millions of forgotten parents around the world. And by staying connected, we keep their voices alive. When people looked at Richard Miller from the outside, they saw a strong man with a wide smile who always seemed to have everything under control. They saw a father who took his kids to school, who cheered at soccer games, who clapped proudly at graduations. They admired him for raising 7 children alone. What they didn't see, what no one truly understood, were the sacrifices hidden behind that smile. Richard was not a wealthy man. After his wife's passing, he worked as a construction supervisor by day and as a janitor in the evenings. He left home before sunrise and often returned long after midnight, yet somehow still managed to cook, clean, and care for 7 children. He rarely slept more than 4 hours a night. His co-workers often wondered how he kept going, but Richard never explained. The truth was simple. Love kept him alive. But love came with a cost. Richard's health was the first to suffer. He ignored back pain from lifting heavy beams at construction sites. He skipped doctor's appointments, convincing himself it was just age catching up. When he caught the flu, he worked through it because missing a day meant missing wages, and missing wages meant less food on the table. His body begged for rest, but his children's laughter pushed him forward. Finances were always tight. Richard kept meticulous notes in a worn leather notebook, writing every expense. $20 for groceries, $15 for bus fare, $50 for electricity. Sometimes he had to choose between paying the gas bill or buying new shoes for one of the kids. And almost always, the children came first. He walked miles to work in worn-out boots so Michael could have a new pair for school. He ate leftovers or skipped dinner entirely so Emily and Sarah could have proper meals before their exams. His coat was patched in 3 places, but John had a brand new winter jacket. The sacrifices weren't just financial. They were personal, too. Richard once dreamed of owning his own small repair shop. He had a talent for fixing things, from engines to furniture. He imagined a sign with his name, Miller Repairs, and a steady income that would let him breathe easier. But when his wife passed and the children's needs grew heavier, that dream was folded away, like an old letter. Instead of saving for his future, he poured every penny into theirs. And then there was love, the possibility of finding a new partner, of not spending his life alone. Neighbors occasionally suggested he remarry, that a woman could help him raise the children. But Richard always shook his head. His focus was on Michael, David, John, Emily, Sarah, Anna, and James. He couldn't imagine dividing his attention, couldn't risk bringing someone into their fragile world who might not love them the way he did. His heart belonged entirely to his children, and he chose to carry the burden alone. Perhaps the hardest sacrifices were emotional. There were moments when Richard felt invisible, even in his own home. Children don't often recognize sacrifices. They only see the results. When James wanted a new toy, he didn't know his father had skipped lunch for 2 weeks to save up for it. When Emily asked for money for a school trip, she didn't realize Richard had worked double shifts, coming home so exhausted that he fell asleep still wearing his work boots. When Sarah showed off her new dress at school, she never knew her father had worn the same shirt to work for 3 years. Richard didn't blame them. They were children. It wasn't their fault. He wanted their world to feel full, safe, and abundant, even if it meant his world was empty. But deep down, he hoped that someday, when they were older, they would look back and see the sacrifices written in the lines on his face, in the calluses on his hands, and in the quiet tears he sometimes shed at night. There were times he longed for recognition, not money, not gifts, just words. A simple "thank you, Dad," or "we see what you're doing." But often, children only appreciate what they had once it's gone. And Richard was too proud to ask for gratitude. He carried his sacrifices silently, believing love was enough. One cold winter night, Richard sat by the kitchen window, watching the snow fall. His stomach was empty. He had given the last of the stew to the kids, but his heart was full as he listened to their laughter upstairs. He whispered to himself, "This is enough. Their joy is enough." Yet a small ache gnawed at him. the ache of a man giving his entire soul without knowing if anyone would ever truly understand. And so the years went by. Sacrifice became routine. Pain became normal. Richard's life was a long list of things given up so his children could thrive. He didn't see himself as a hero. He didn't see himself as extraordinary. He was simply a father who had decided long ago that his children's happiness was worth more than his own. But life is cruel. The sacrifices Richard made, the health he gave up, the dreams he abandoned, they went unnoticed. His children enjoyed the comfort he created, but they never saw the cost. And one day, when they grew older and successful, they would forget not just his sacrifices, but the man himself. That truth was waiting for Richard like a storm on the horizon. And though he didn't know it yet, the sacrifices he made in silence would become the very reason he felt forgotten. Because when love is taken for granted, it doesn't just break a heart, it shatters it. For years, Richard Miller had lived for one dream, to see his 7 children, Michael, David, John, Emily, Sarah, Anna, and James, grow into strong, independent adults. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every drop of sweat that fell from his brow was an investment in their future. And in many ways, his dream came true. Michael, the eldest, became an engineer, building bridges in bustling cities. David, once the mischievous prankster, matured into a successful entrepreneur with his own company. John, the quiet bookworm, pursued medicine and became a respected doctor. Emily, with her talent for singing and creativity, became a music teacher loved by her students. Sarah went into law, fighting cases in court with determination. Anna, the sensitive soul, became a schoolteacher, just as she had whispered to Richard as a child. And James, the youngest, grew into a confident young man working in finance, handling investments and clients with ease. Richard couldn't have been prouder. He looked at their accomplishments and felt his sacrifices were worth it. When he sat alone in his small living room, he would sometimes close his eyes and whisper, "I did it. I kept my promise." He thought that now, in this season of life, his children would be by his side, returning the love and care he had poured into them. But reality rarely matches our hopes. At first, things were still good. Michael would call once a week, asking, "Dad, how are you holding up?" Emily visited on weekends with her guitar, playing songs for her father. John would send medical advice over the phone, reminding him to take his pills. The others, too, checked in occasionally, their voices filling the silence of his home. Richard felt blessed. Then, slowly, life began to change. Michael got married and moved to another state. His calls became less frequent. "Sorry, Dad, I've been busy with work. I'll call next week." Weeks turned into months. David's company grew, consuming his time. "Dad, I'll visit soon. I promise." The visits never came. John's shifts at the hospital stretched longer, leaving little time for family. Emily's weekends filled with recitals. Sarah drowned in case files, Anna in her teaching duties, and James in his corporate meetings. Richard understood at first. Life was demanding. He told himself, "They're busy. That's a good thing. It means they're successful." He excused their absence, reassured himself that things would get better. But they didn't. The house that once overflowed with noise and energy was now silent. The phone that once rang with laughter now sat still. Birthdays came and went, sometimes with a quick phone call, sometimes with nothing at all. Holidays grew lonelier. Thanksgiving dinners shrank from a table filled with children to a quiet meal for one. At Christmas, he decorated the house alone, waiting for a knock on the door that never came. Neighbors noticed. They saw Richard sitting on the porch, staring down the street as though waiting for someone. They would ask, "Are the kids coming this weekend?" Richard would force a smile and say, "They're busy. You know how it is." But inside, his heart ached. The sharpest pain wasn't the silence. It was the excuses. Every time he reached out, there was always a reason they couldn't come. "The kids have soccer, Dad." "We're planning a trip, Dad." "Work's been crazy, Dad." He wanted to shout, "What about me? What about the man who gave you everything?" But he didn't. He was too proud, too loving, too afraid of pushing them further away. One night, Richard set the table for 8, just like he used to. He laid out plates for Michael, David, John, Emily, Sarah, Anna, and James. He poured water into glasses and placed forks neatly beside each plate. Then he sat at the head of the table, staring at the empty chairs. The silence was suffocating. Tears blurred his vision as he whispered, "I gave you everything. Why do I feel so forgotten?" As the years passed, Richard's loneliness grew heavier. His health began to decline. His hands shook as he cooked. His legs ached when he walked. Sometimes he fell asleep in his chair, hoping to wake up to a phone call or a knock at the door. Sometimes he dreamed of his children laughing together in the living room, only to wake up to silence that broke him all over again. What hurt most was the contrast. He would watch neighbors' children visit their parents every weekend, bringing groceries, gifts, or simply their presence. He saw elderly couples walking hand in hand with their grown-up children, sharing meals together at restaurants, celebrating birthdays. And he wondered, why not me? Did I do something wrong? Did I not love enough? The truth was harsher. His love hadn't failed. It had been taken for granted. His sacrifices had built his children's lives, but in building them up, he had allowed himself to disappear. They didn't mean to hurt him, but they had. Success became separation. The very independence he worked so hard to give them became the reason they forgot him. Richard still loved them fiercely. He never spoke ill of his children. When asked, he always said, "They're doing well. They make me proud." But inside, the pride was mixed with sorrow. His children had flown so far, they forgot the nest that had sheltered them. And so, the laughter that once filled the Miller home was gone. The walls that had echoed with joy now stood in silence. Richard was alone, surrounded not by his children but by memories. Memories of sacrifices, of laughter, of chaos, of love. Memories that hurt more than they healed. It was then, in the midst of this aching loneliness, that Richard realized something. He had to make a choice. He could either spend his final years waiting for calls that might never come, or he could do something that would change everything. And in that moment of painful clarity, the seeds of a decision began to grow. A decision that no one saw coming. There's a unique kind of silence that weighs heavier than noise, heavier than chaos, heavier even than grief. It is the silence of an empty home, a silence that eats away at the heart. Richard Miller knew this silence well. Once, his house had been alive, filled with the voices of 7 children, the sounds of doors slamming, laughter echoing through the halls, and arguments that were always followed by reconciliation. Now, those sounds existed only in his memory, while the present gave him nothing but stillness. Richard's mornings began in solitude. He would wake to the shrill ring of an alarm clock, but no little feet thundered down the hallway anymore. He still made coffee, still placed 2 slices of bread in the toaster, but the kitchen that once overflowed with hungry kids now felt too big, too empty. Sometimes, out of habit, he poured more juice into the jug as though Sarah or Anna would come rushing in late for breakfast. Then he would catch himself and sigh, realizing it was only him. The table that once required extra chairs for 7 children now sat with a single plate, a single fork, a single cup. Richard often lingered over his meals, not because he enjoyed them, but because he dreaded the hours of silence that stretched ahead. The days were long. With retirement forced upon him by age and health, he had little to do except clean, read, and wait. He swept floors that never got dirty, dusted picture frames that no one touched, and watered plants that were his only companions. He had a television, but even the sound of it felt artificial compared to the warmth of human voices. The photographs on the walls became both his comfort and his torment. In one, Michael and David stood proudly in their graduation gowns. In another, Emily and Sarah sang together at a school recital. Anna smiled shyly in her first teacher's uniform, while James held a soccer trophy nearly as big as he was. Richard often stood before those photos, tracing the outlines of his children's faces with trembling fingers. "Where are you now?" he whispered. Evenings were the hardest. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the house grew darker, colder, and lonelier. Richard would sit in his armchair, staring at the front door, half expecting it to open. He imagined James rushing in with his wife and children, Emily playing her guitar in the corner, Michael bringing stories of his work. But the door remained closed, and the silence mocked him. Loneliness was not just the absence of people, it was the absence of care. Richard had once been the center of 7 lives. Every scraped knee, every school project, every heartbreak had led his children running into his arms. Now, even when he fell ill, no one was there. One winter, he collapsed in the kitchen from exhaustion and spent hours on the cold floor before finding the strength to pull himself up. When he told John later, his son said gently, "Dad, you have to take better care of yourself." But there was no offer to come visit, no suggestion to move closer. Richard's heart sank. What cut deeper than the silence were the reminders of what others had. Richard often glanced out his window to see his neighbor, Mr. Thompson, sitting on the porch surrounded by his children and grandchildren. They shared meals together, laughed together, and filled the evenings with warmth. Richard smiled politely when they waved, but inside, jealousy and sorrow twisted in his chest. He wondered, why not me? Why do my children not see me the way his children see him? In the quiet hours of the night, Richard's thoughts turned darker. He wondered if he had failed somehow. Had he been too strict? Too soft? Did his sacrifices not matter? Did his children ever realize the cost of the life they enjoyed? The questions circled endlessly, but no answers came. The silence swallowed them all. One evening, as he sat by the window, snow falling softly outside, Richard whispered aloud, "I feel like I've become invisible." His voice cracked, and tears slid down his cheeks. He wasn't afraid of dying. He had faced hardship all his life. What he feared was dying forgotten, as though his love, his struggles, his very existence had meant nothing. He began to write in a notebook, letters, thoughts, pieces of advice. He wrote about his love for Michael, his pride in David, his admiration for John, his affection for Emily and Sarah, his hopes for Anna, his joy in James. He wrote the things he couldn't say on the phone when calls were rushed. These pages became his only way of speaking. Despite the emptiness, Richard tried to stay hopeful. Every time the phone rang, his heart leapt, praying it was one of his children. Sometimes it was a quick call, a hurried conversation, a promise to visit that never came true. Other times, it was a telemarketer, and the disappointment felt like another wound. His health declined steadily. Walking became harder. Cooking felt like a chore. His hands shook more, his eyesight blurred, and the medication bottles on his counter multiplied. Yet still, he endured the silence. Still he waited. Still he hoped. But the longer he waited, the clearer it became. The silence wasn't temporary. It was permanent. His children were not coming back, not the way they used to. Their lives were full, and in their fullness, there was no space left for him. It was during one of those long, lonely evenings that Richard's heart finally shifted. He realized he could no longer live like this, trapped in silence, waiting for a knock that never came. He needed to do something, not for his children, but for himself. Something that would break the silence, something that would leave a mark, something that would remind his children, and the world, of who he truly was. And so, in the depths of his loneliness, Richard began to form a plan, a decision that would not only shatter the silence, but also change everything. Richard Miller had spent years swallowed by silence, abandoned not in body, but in spirit. His children lived their lives far away, too consumed by their own struggles and successes to notice the man who had once sacrificed everything for them. Yet within that loneliness, a fire still burned, quiet but steady. Richard was tired of waiting for them to remember him. If they would not come back to him, then he would leave behind something they could never forget. For weeks, Richard thought deeply about what to do. He could have chosen bitterness, writing a scathing letter filled with anger and regret. He could have cut ties entirely, leaving nothing behind. But Richard's heart, despite the pain, still held love. He didn't want his children to remember him with guilt or resentment. He wanted them to learn, to grow, to understand what family truly meant. One snowy morning, Richard gathered his notebooks, the letters he had been writing late at night, filled with advice, memories, and confessions. Each one carried a piece of his soul, stories of his struggles, the love he had poured into raising them, and the hope he still held for their futures. He bundled them neatly, one for each child. Then he wrote a final letter, a message meant not to punish, but to awaken. In that letter, he said, My beloved children, Michael, David, John, Emily, Sarah, Anna, and James. If you are reading this, it means my time here is over. Do not cry for me, because I lived a full life, one filled with love, mostly because of you. I raised you alone, and every sacrifice I made with joy. But I must tell you this truth. Life is short, and love cannot wait. I spent too many years in silence, waiting for visits that never came. I don't blame you, but I want you to understand that family is not forever. It is only for as long as you choose to nurture it. Don't repeat this mistake with each other, or with your own children. Love them now, while you still can. Pick up the phone, knock on the door, say the words before it's too late. That will be my legacy, not wealth, not possessions, but a reminder that love only lives when it is shared. When the letters were complete, Richard made one more decision. Instead of leaving his small savings, his modest house, and his belongings to his children, he donated a large portion to a local shelter that supported struggling single parents. He knew firsthand what it was like to raise children alone, to feel invisible, to battle exhaustion without help. He wanted his story to inspire and empower others like him. If my own children forgot me, he thought, perhaps others will remember me by the lives I help. This was his final act of love, not just to his children, but to the world. When the day finally came and Richard's body gave way to time, the news reached his children. At first, they were shocked, numb with disbelief. They had always assumed he would be there, waiting, endlessly patient, a permanent fixture in their lives. The reality of his absence struck them like a thunderbolt. At the reading of his will, they discovered the letters. One by one, they opened the envelopes, their hands trembling, their eyes brimming with tears. Michael, the eldest, broke down first. He still loved us, even after everything. David sat in silence, guilt heavy on his chest. Emily and Sarah clung to each other, reading their letters aloud, sobbing. James, the youngest, whispered, "We should have been there. We should have come home." But beyond the grief was the undeniable truth Richard left behind. His children had been given one last chance, not to fix the past, but to change the future. They gathered at the old house, the same home that had once echoed with their childhood voices. For the first time in years, the 7 siblings sat together around the dining table. The silence that once haunted Richard was replaced with conversations, memories, and promises. They realized they had been given more than letters. They had been given a second chance at family. As they packed away his belongings, they found Richard's journal, the one he had written during his final years. In it, he had detailed his struggles, his loneliness, and the moments of joy he still cherished. His words painted a picture not of a bitter man, but of a father who never stopped loving. The children knew then that their father's decision had changed everything. His choice to speak the truth, to leave behind not wealth, but wisdom, was more powerful than anything else he could have given. It forced them to confront their neglect, but it also gave them the tools to repair what was broken between them. Michael later gathered his siblings and said, "We can't undo what we did to Dad, but we can honor him by never making the same mistake with each other. We are all we have left of him." And in that moment, Richard's greatest wish came true. His children finally understood the meaning of family. Richard Miller's story is not just about loneliness. It is about love, sacrifice, and the consequences of neglect. His final act taught a truth that too many forget. Parents are not eternal, and their love, though unconditional, deserves to be returned while they are still alive. Family is not about blood alone. It is about presence, about choosing to show up, about cherishing the people who once carried you through life. Richard's decision to donate to struggling parents was his way of saying, "Don't wait until it's too late. Give love now." And so, the legacy of one forgotten father became a reminder to countless others. A reminder that silence can be broken, that lessons can still be taught, even from beyond the grave. A reminder that the most valuable inheritance a parent can leave is not money or property, but the wisdom to love deeply, and the courage to never take family for granted.